podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.
Hello everyone, I'm Chris Wynn and welcome to How We're the podcast from Roker Report. And we continue to bask in the wake of that moment in the 122nd minute at the Stadium of Light against Coventry last Tuesday. And you'll still be unsurprised that Gav hasn't stopped watching or talking about it. So you won't be surprised to hear that he's back on to talk about it all again. All right, Gav?
Yes, very good, mate. Yes, yeah, to talk about it, but then keen to look ahead too. So I think that's going to be the feature of today, isn't it?
Well, we're going to be doing a little looking back and a little looking forward. I don't think that's probably too cryptic because if people already know who's on, they'll probably guess where we're already going. But I assume you're still soaking yourself in everything you can get about that Tuesday night.
Yeah, definitely. And I'll never get bored. As I said on the last one, I'll never get bored of that Ballard goal. So I think I've watched at least 300 different angles of it, at least 100 times each angle. Yeah, probably broke records for the amount of video I've consumed since Tuesday night. Saying that, I imagine every Sunderland fan's done the exact same thing. It's been just a glorious week, hasn't it? I've even been watching other teams play, which I've said before I don't do. I don't care about watching other teams play, but I'm not immersed in football. I found myself watching Marseille last night, of all things, just because I wanted to watch some football. It's amazing, isn't it? What a bit of positivity it can do for you.
Well, it's funny. I thought that I was watching the cup final, and I thought if Sunderland had actually been knocked out and we got beat off Coventry, I wouldn't have bothered with that. I would have just went, exactly. I don't care. No, not bothered at all. But we'll go through it all again and get maybe a different perspective, because to give us that and maybe add a little bit, about the perspective of the whole thing, rather than just replaying those few seconds from when Lefebvre kissed the ball next to the corner flag to when the ball hit the back of the net. Because not only does he provide wise words, he was, of course, part of an unforgettable playoff campaign back in 1990. We are very pleased, as always, to have Kieron Brady with us. Hello, Kieron.
Good morning. Good morning.
Good morning. How are you doing this early Sunday morning?
Very well. I'm more than accustomed now to enjoying the birdsong that I frequently hear each Sunday morning, whereas once upon a time a Sunday morning would have been filled with dread and an insatiable appetite to go and do what I'd done in the first place. So I'm up with the larks, as they say, and I will be going on my cross trainer in about an hour's time, as I generally would, to keep up the pretense of fitness.
Well, talking about birdsong, if you're anything like Gav, he's just had birds circling his head all week, just singing the songs of, what the lads are singing at the Stadium of Light. But where did you watch the action on Tuesday night?
I watched it at home. I, like anyone else, was completely engrossed, and I had concerns before the match about Regis Bris's decisions around how to approach it, and I did have, I was uncertain as to how the broad support would accept a strategy of containment like we'd witnessed in the first leg. But I suppose when you get to this stage of the season, particularly in the playoffs, then the primary, some would argue the only focus, is about negotiating a path through those 180 minutes, or 222 as it was, and thankfully they managed to do that.
Yeah, that's it. Well, look, we'll go through the whole thing and get your thoughts on everything in that playoff semi-final. But you were, of course, part of a side who played out, possibly the biggest ever playoff semi-final in the club's history, if not the kind of most epic playoff semi-final that there's been in terms of kind of between the two sides. And you, of course, ended up Wembley, and it was the first year that the finals were played in the capital. But can you remember the pressure around the squad? I know obviously it was probably ramped up because we played Newcastle, but and maybe you're going back, what I'm trying to count, was it 35 years? But that maybe that prize on offer wasn't maybe as lucrative as it is now. But can you remember that there was still a huge pressure when the normal season ended and you went into the playoffs?
I can. I mean, we were in the fortuitous position that I think we'd managed to secure our playoff spot the week before the last game of the season. So we were already aware that a playoff position had been secured, but what we weren't aware of was exactly who we would come up against. And of course, as events transpired, it became clear that it would be Newcastle in the semi-final with the first leg at home. And I think there was 8 days between the regular season ending and the first leg at Roker Park. And Newcastle came into the playoff, I think, with that feeling of disappointment because they'd missed out on automatic promotion on the last day of the season, having lost at Middlesbrough, who in turn had, I think, from memory, avoided relegation by beating Newcastle on that particular day. So, from a psychological perspective, there may well have been a little bit of despondency within the Newcastle camp, but both league matches had ended in a draw. So, from those games, it was perfectly clear that there wasn't a great amount between the sides. And of course, the third match of the season, the playoff first leg, would end in a stalemate as well. So by the time we went to St James's, which was 3 days later, I think, the broad football and fraternity, if you like, were probably feeling that Newcastle, with home advantage, would at the very least start as favourites. But towards the end of the season, we'd showed a lot of good form away from home. So we were relatively confident that we could go there, at the very least, perhaps take it to extra time. But as history shows us, that wasn't necessary. And the G-Force was able to come to the surface and produce the goods, one at the very beginning of the game, and then, of course, Marco towards the end. So, we managed to negotiate that rather very successfully. And then I think the lads this time have got an 11-day turnaround period. I think we had 12 because their bank playoff final was in the bank holiday Monday. So it was 12 days between the Wednesday and the second Monday afterwards.
Yeah. And actually, just because it's relevant, because look, Kieron, me and Gav talked about it a lot in terms of the running, that, Sunderland players didn't have that much to play for. And we talked to a few players like Gordon Armstrong and Martin Smith who said, that players, when, the heat's on and the pressure's on, kind of can flick that switch. And you talked about that last day of the season because we'd already qualified for the playoffs and then we played Oldham Athletic, who were a good side at the time under Joe Royal, to be fair. But was that almost felt at the time that last day of the season, because it was meaningless in the grand scheme of things, that actually the players didn't hit top gear because just they didn't have to?
I mean, I suppose you always have it in the back of your mind that one of your objectives of the season has been secured, but I think it can be difficult. And I think, again, it would be a player-by-player experience. I mean, I was only 18. So for me, even playing in pre-season friendlies at the beginning of that season when I was 17, I was trying to make my way in the game. And any opportunity I got to play for the first team, whether it's a pre-season friendly or a perceived meaningless fixture at the end of the regular campaign, was always going to be a chance for me to try and prove my worth. I think some of the more experienced players, the guys that had racked up 300 and 400 appearances over a career, perhaps felt different. And of course, as you touch upon, Oldham were a very good side at the time, and they'd been distracted by having cup runs, I believe, in both competitions that season.
Yeah.
So when we lost the game, I think it was 3-2 that day, there wouldn't have been the same sense of grievance as there would at losing most other fixtures at Roker Park. And then, of course, all concentration was focused on our nearest and dearest from up the road, arriving 8 days later. And from memory, again, the game was tense, probably scrappy at times. And we had the chance, of course, to go to St James's Park with a 1-goal advantage, but Paul Hardiman had his penalty very well saved by John Burridge, and then decided in a moment of frustration to exact the most brutal of revenge. And I think John Burridge's head is due to arrive in Fulwell Road, I think in March 2029. So it was a very impassioned, maybe typical end to a derby game that had so much riding on it.
Mm. yeah. I mean, actually, just on that, because just quiz you while we've got you, Kieron, because Colin Pascoe was carrying an injury towards the end of the season, and obviously Dennis Smith had a few decisions to make. And in that first leg, he went with Paul Hardiman left midfield and Agbula at left back. And then obviously you've just said, Paul Hardiman got sent off and then got suspended for the second leg. And then he went with Warren Hawke, who hadn't been seen since the start of that season against Swindon, opening day. And you were on the bench for both games. I mean, just because in the context of Chris Mepham maybe missing out because he'd been involved quite obviously a lot and then was dropped for these games. I mean, did Dennis Smith have a conversation with you? And, how did you feel? Because you must have thought, I'm in with a chance here because with all the injuries and suspensions on that left-hand side.
Well, I suppose at that stage, the general course of events for players like Warren and myself, Paul Williams, Brian Atkinson, would be that it was unlikely that we were going to play, almost every single game, and that our introduction into first-team football would be piecemeal. And I don't recall being particularly disappointed. I can't even remember if Dennis explained that Warren, albeit playing out of position, would provide greater cover in what you might typically expect in a second leg at St James's Park. He would be much more willing to do the defensive side of things than I would. And to that end, I believe that Dennis was completely vindicated in playing him. If you're keeping a clean sheet, and Warren, of course, had a part in the second goal, by which time the wind and the weather and the rain were playing a significant part. So Dennis got that absolutely spot on. He really did, and he deserves a lot of credit for it. And of course, I might not have seen it strictly in those terms at the time, but these are the decisions that a manager has to take, and at times you'll fall by them. But in that particular occasion, he got it absolutely right.
Yeah. I imagine you were absolutely chomping at the bit to get on from the bench in these big games.
I mean, in looking back now, and maybe in my naivety at the time, I thought I'm going to be playing football till I'm 35. I'll play against Newcastle, I'm sure, at some point. But I suppose if when people speak to me about regrets, and I don't have too many, because I believe that the good far outweighs the bad. And of course, we got to the FA Cup final a couple of seasons later. But for some strange reason, if I'm asked about playing, if I'd ever played at Wembley, I certainly felt I'd have been able to provide more or produce more in the game against Swindon at Wembley, as opposed to the FA Cup final 2 years later against Liverpool. And I played against Middlesbrough for Sunderland and I scored. But I'm probably the only person on Weir side that, for personal selfish reasons, tries to shoehorn a Sunderland Middlesbrough game into the category of a derby. Because I know fine well that there's only one derby in this part of the world. But, if people do ask me, did you ever play in a derby? Did you ever score in a derby? I'm inclined to say yes, but then say I'm trying to exploit a loophole here. Because I know that it's red and white and black and white, and that's all that matters.
Yeah. I mean, Gav, just to kind of get your thoughts on it, because it's we've just beaten a side where you might almost kind of say that Coventry are almost kind of fake rivals, if you like, or manufactured rivals but going back then, when you saw how the roof came off in that moment playing Coventry, and it probably felt a bit more because it had that edge because it was Coventry. But imagine getting the Mags in the semi-final of the playoffs and then beating them, especially away from home. I mean, you're soaking in a last-minute goal against Coventry, which is brilliant. But because I was only about 7 at the time, too young to really take it in and accept it for what it was. But I mean, just imagine in this day and age, we beat the Mags in the Championship playoff semi-final.
It would be massive, wouldn't it? And I guess at that point as well, Sunderland and Newcastle were a lot more level in terms of, playing budgets, crowd sizes, and all the rest of it than they are these days. So, I guess it's the biggest prize, isn't it? Where maybe the last couple of times Newcastle have dropped into the Championship, they've kind of just bought their way out and been the biggest club in the league and managed to get out pretty swiftly. But no, I imagine it was amazing. I guess, for our era, it's nice, or my era, it's nice to hear stories about that run, because it almost...
I mean, it immediately after the game at St James's, which was on a Wednesday night, the decision was taken by people in the higher echelons of the club. And by higher echelons, I don't necessarily mean like Dennis Smith or the coaching staff. I'm talking about board members. And I just went with the flow. And I think as a young player, that's what you're expected to do. You don't influence decisions. You just go with whatever is being said. And later that evening, we came back to Sunderland City Centre in our club tracksuits and we went nightclubbing. And when I say we, I don't just mean the players. I'm talking Bob Murray, Jeff Davison, Dennis Smith, Malcolm Crosby, Viv Busby. We were all in Finos. And obviously you can imagine that this is the day before live football matches were commonplace. But of course, the overwhelming majority of the people in Finos would have been attuned to what had happened several hours previous. So, there wasn't an open-top bus parade, but in Finos there was a parade. And, we were sort of treated as returning heroes. And it was one of the greatest nights I had as a Sunderland player. But by the time it got to 4 or 5 days, so this is the Sunday between the playoff second leg and the showpiece at Wembley. And we, at that particular time, on the Sunday, we were in Menorca, one of the Balearic Islands, the smaller brother or sister of Mallorca. And we'd been there since the Friday. And again, in my naivety, I had went there with this playing squad and the coaches and manager under the impression that we were going to be doing some, what they call in modern parlance, warm weather training, only to find that the sort of procedure wasn't so much warm weather training, it was just warm weather drinking. And, for 3 days and 3 nights, we were drinking, and it really surprised me and took me aback, because even in that era where drinking cultures within football clubs was commonplace, I actually felt that given we had just over a week to prepare for the biggest game of the season, for the biggest game of the careers of many of the players involved, that the drinking culture could wait, and obviously once the last game has been played, then of course there's an opportunity to let your hair down. But it was, I still look back on it with incredulity, because it was. I don't believe for a moment that Swindon were preparing in a similar manner. They might have went away, but I don't believe it would have been with an allowance to do all of the things that would be incompatible with being an athlete. But sports science, if you want to call it as such, in that period, very much revolved around a very primitive notion that if you put alcohol into your system, as long as you've got the opportunity to run it out of your system in the days after, then all is well. And of course, there would be sports scientists and nutritionists listening to me now thinking, my God, it's just a very, not only unprofessional, but very possibly an unhealthy way for an athlete to believe they can act. But then we came back on the Monday and we did train very, very hard on the Tuesday and the Wednesday and the Thursday to try and get all of it out of our system. And then, the Friday, Saturday, Sunday was probably taken up more with like tactics and how we were going to attempt to play. And then, of course, Now, I don't know this, but it may well be that the highest echelons at the club felt we could go to Menorca because regardless of the outcome at Wembley,
Yeah.
we were going to be promoted. Now, I know that it's still something of a debate at times between fans as to just how much information we had about the financial chicanery Swindon Town Football Club and what the implications of that might be. But I can say with confidence that none of the players were under the impression that the outcome was meaningless. We certainly did not have information that stated definitively that we were going to be promoted, even if Swindon had beaten us at Wembley. Our performance might have looked like that. But we didn't, just on the day Swindon played exceptionally well and Tony Norman came to our rescue on any number of occasions, and it was ironic that it took a little bit of good fortune for Swindon to get what would be the only goal. But, for us, and certainly for me, having to retire so young, it had a very happy ending because I definitely would have regretted having had to retire at such a young age without ever playing in the top flight. And of course, whatever was going on at Swindon in the months or years preceding that particular game at Wembley allowed us the opportunity to go and challenge at the highest level of the game.
Yeah.
Can I just ask something, actually? This is something I haven't, again, because it wasn't of my era, maybe, but we've talked a lot about 1990 on here recently, haven't we? And one thing I've never really heard asked is, what do you think would have happened had we not been promoted? Had that decision not gone our way, what direction do you think the club would have taken from that point? Because obviously we would have to go again, wouldn't we? But would we have held on to all of our best players? Would we have? Would things have gone better the season after, or how do you feel things would have went?
I really don't know, Gab, because players generally aren't privy to a lot of the considerations and conversations that take place around the direction of a club. I think Dennis Smith, given his character, given the type of player he was, and given how that was reflected in how he managed, I think he would have been more than happy and certainly more than willing to go again, as it were. I think from an exclusively footballing perspective, Dennis Smith might have tried to frame it that the Swindon players were better than us on the day. Whatever's going on behind the scenes, certainly wasn't dreamt up by them. Irrespective of all of that, we just knuckle down, we go again, and see where that takes us. And from memory, I don't think you had many players at that particular point who, would maybe have felt that they had the sufficient quality to go at that point and play in the old First Division, the Premier League, as is now. And of course, what also has to be factored in is that the financial disparity between the top flight and the second division, or the Premier League and the Championship, wasn't anything like it is now. So I don't think there would have been any clamour from numerous players to leave. Bearing in mind also, we'd finished sixth. We'd only been promoted, 2 years previous from the third tier. So maybe because we hadn't been set up for a fall, it might have been more disappointing for us as players if we'd been told, look, even if Swindon are successful on the day, you're getting promoted, only to find that had been reversed. So I'm sure Dennis Smith and Viv Busby, Crosser, others, the players would have just got on with the task in hand.
It's an interesting contrast to the current situation, that's all, because we don't really want to talk about this. But if we don't win at Wembley, you're looking at the squad and thinking we could be picked apart. You know what I mean? So it feels like a pivotal moment, really, in the modern history of Sunderland, this, doesn't it?
Well, you're right, Gav. And, there's no getting away from the fact that in my era, greed within football was very, very evident. And I believe that is now off the scale. You know, and when I say greed, I don't mean it's exclusively about, you know, greed in such a nasty and pejorative manner. But I think we can look at, for example, you know, at that particular time, I could say, for example, myself, right, because there was clubs interested, and I could have left Sunderland and perhaps went to a top flight club. But in leaving Sunderland to go from a top flight to a top flight club, I wouldn't have been going from a meagre wage to a life-changing contract. Tommy Watson is.
Oh.
Yeah.
Right? You know, he's going from somewhere in the region of £1,000, £1,500 a week, which of course gets taxed. So by the time he gets his net pay at the end of each month, it's still a very, very good salary for someone his age, but it's most certainly not life-changing. But by the time he takes to the field, I suspect, for Brighton's reserves, he's probably going to be coming home each month with about £60,000 per week, there or thereabouts. And that is very, very difficult to look at, especially when, in my day as well, probably only about 10% of players had agents, maybe a bit more. But now, probably maybe 100%, if they want an agent, have one. And of course, they've got their own interests to pursue. But part of pursuing their own interests is impressing upon the player that the contract that's on offer elsewhere is of a type that will allow you to develop your career, because they have to come across in a morally sound manner. But of course, it will give them that financial security, at least for a number of years, because we're talking, it's a significant increase that you're going to go. And if you're going for 10 million, the buying club has to justify that in reflecting it in the contract that's offered.
Yeah. I'm still staggered, Kieron, that you've given away your get out of jail free card for going on the lash for 3 days before the playoff final.
Well,
should have said we knew about Swindon, so we just went on the piss.
No, I don't know. I mean, Paul Bracewell, Benno, the more senior pros may have had more information than some of the others did. But we were certainly not led to believe that the game had become meaningless, because whether Sunderland won or whether Swindon won, it was clear that at the very least Swindon wouldn't be getting promoted. There was obviously some toing and froing about Newcastle having finished third and Sheffield Wednesday having been a relegated side from the top flight. So we certainly weren't under any impression that it was going to be us simply because we played in the final, whether we'd won or not.
Yeah. Well, look, if any of our listeners want to get a bit more information on all of that Swindon Town malarkey, we spoke to Bill Bradshaw a week or so ago, and well, we spoke to him years ago, but we released the pod a week or so ago, so you can go back and listen to all that and get all the details from him. But let's go to the modern day, and let's go back to these two legs against Coventry, Kieron. I think you've already touched on it, but that first leg away from home, the manager made that change with Ballard at the back, and then he went with what seemed on paper to be a 4-4-2, but it ended up being that kind of two banks of four, backs to the wall performance. We managed to nick that 2-1 win. I mean, I think you've already touched on it, but what did you make of the way we set up in that first leg and how we approached it by essentially allowing Coventry to have the ball and us wait for our opportunity?
Well, I think I'd said on air a number of weeks ago when there was a relative uproar from the fans at how poor the performances and outcomes had been in the last 5 or 6 games of the 46-game season, that the luxury that Regis Bris had at the time was that in knowing they were going to be in the playoffs and knowing that the second leg was going to be at the Stadium of Light, that they could work on a few things ahead of the away first leg. And I think he since says that, you know, that at least it was on his mind, and they probably done some things in training around that. And the approach for that particular game was as good as it could be. And not only that, it was added to by the inclusion of Ballard and his performance. The decision to play Maenda and Isidore, even if one at times was dropping back to try and block the pathways between the lines. So I think on the Saturday morning after, for all the fans, the players, the coaching staff would have woke up feeling very, very optimistic about what lay ahead. There would have been an added personal satisfaction and vindication, if you like, for the manager, because everything really revolved around that particular game, even if players and fans don't like losing matches. But I think I'm not going to say it's a dilemma, but he's been lauded for the performance at Coventry, and rightly so. But of course, it doesn't necessarily mean that because it worked out so well and people were praising you, that you should adopt a similar approach for Wembley, simply because you're always aware that by the time 90 minutes finishes in the Midlands, it is in effect only half time. And of course, at Wembley, you're going to get one opportunity. So whether he opts to use Maenda and Isidore from the start remains to be seen. Whether he makes changes in personnel elsewhere, of course, is a consideration. And, we can't really disregard the fact that in 90 minutes, they've lost 6 of their last 7 matches. Equally, there's got to be a concern about the lack of goals, particularly goals in open play. And, I don't know then if that'll sort of play on his mind, because he might then think, well, logically, we went to Coventry, we scored 2. It's the 2 centre forwards that have scored. So shall we take that risk and use that approach, even if they don't necessarily play a containing game the same way that they may have at Coventry? So there's all of these things to go through. And, I suppose you could take some comfort from the fact that he does have experience of, getting up from the second tier, albeit in France. So, it's going to be interesting. I watched, funny enough, I watched both legs of the other playoff, and I suppose it would have been better. It would have been better if Sheffield United had missed out on automatic promotion on the last day of the season. And I felt that when they had their bad run, well, they lost 3 successive games, I believe, it was 3, though, Plymouth, Luton, or Oxford, something like that. I just was hoping that they wouldn't return to a little bit of form, in games 44, 45, 46, and then, of course, 47 and 48. And they have, they certainly looked, apart from the first 15 minutes or so at Bramall Lane, they look a cut above Bristol City, and certainly in terms of how clinical they can be. And I suppose, if going back to the second leg at the Stadium of Light, as much as I think Ballard and Lucanine over the piece defended extremely well, but I wouldn't want to be giving Kiefer Moore the same chance that Haji Wright had at the very, very end, because for all Haji Wright scored a hat-trick against us in the league game down there, he's not, and for all his stature, he's not the greatest in terms of aerial ability, but Kiefer Moore would have probably at least worked Anthony Patterson with a chance like that.
Yeah, well, Kieron, you said in that you said, that the manager got the plaudits, and rightly so. Is he completely vindicated by the results? Because as you've just said, away from home, as much as we defended absolutely brilliant, 2 banks of 4, backs to the wall, all of that, it is a risky way of setting up. And there was a moment in the first few minutes in the away leg where Patterson had the flap off a cross that could have easily bounced somewhere else and ended up in the back of the net. Then you've got, and that was the away leg. I don't think we meant to have a similar game at home, but we'll come on to that in a minute. But by setting up like that, and there was a a tweet, I think, from Hooley Walker, where he actually went against the grain after the first leg and said it was a poor performance, that with the players we've got, we maybe should have kept the ball more and been more on the front foot. So, do you kind of go with that, right, we got that bit of luck and we deserved it, or, that it is a risky way to play and we got the rub of the green?
Well, I mean, I don't think there's any approach you can take in football that is completely risk-free. And the dynamics, of course, change when it becomes a two-legged affair. And if you can navigate a path through the first leg away from home where the tie is still live and you've given yourself a reasonable chance of winning over the two legs, then I think it would be a little bit unjust to be particularly critical. Now, you're right in what you're saying, because if the deeper you sit, you are leaving yourself susceptible to intricate play opening you up or balls from wide coming in that eclipse your centre-backs and manage to find the head of someone like Rudoni, which, of course, happened not long after Isidore had scored. But I think the way you would measure it is, if you're going to play deep and you're going to contain, you have to be pragmatic in acknowledging that over 90 minutes there will be some shots will come in. I think you then have to try and make sure that anybody that's shooting at goal, for example, is not going to get as clean a strike as they like. The path isn't going to be as clear as they would like. That when balls come in from wide, if somebody's going to score a header, it's going to have to be a very, very high quality header, because they're getting challenged, they're getting jumped alongside, all of those things. To that end, I think Sunderland did do well. Now, I've never watched it back, and I think if you watch performances like that back, if, for example, Coventry put 30 crosses into the box and only 7 of them were of a decent standard, and if those 7, if the 23 that weren't, if another 10 of them had been of a better standard, they might have found the head of a Rudoni or a Haji Wright. You might then say, well, it's not worked as well because it's Coventry's substandard delivery that has helped us. But I think it would be really difficult to be critical when you've got, I mean, don't forget, in the build-up to the game and before the 46 game was played, my experience certainly was that the overwhelming majority of fans who I spoke to about who they might prefer to play in the playoffs were saying, I don't want Coventry. I don't want Coventry. That's all I was getting. And of course, it was only about 6 weeks previous that we'd went to Coventry and produced what I think was the most substandard performance of the season. Coventry had both outplayed, outbattled, and of course outscored us on the day. So I think to go to Coventry, to contain them, to limit their chances, to exploit the chances that were created for Sunderland, I think Regis Bris deserves a lot of credit. But where I would probably find maybe some common ground with Julio or anyone else who thinks like that is, if we go to Wembley and play a containing game. Now, if we go to Wembley and play a containing game and we somehow end up winning, Regis Bris is, they'll be starting the statue for him now. But I just think, and I would be inclined to agree with you, Chris, that it comes with greater risk. And I know from my own perspective that even although it ended up with smiles, I know that Patrick Roberts, for example, would not be enjoying the experience because he's having to spend such a huge time running in the direction that is unnatural to him. Now, you can argue, and justifiably so, that even at the Stadium of Light, we weren't seeing a great degree of productivity from him. And it may well be that if there are to be personnel changes, that he's one of the players that is omitted. But if you look at it solely on the games against Sheffield United this season, one home win for them, one home win for Sunderland, both narrow, both displaying enough quality to see that they carry a threat. Ironically enough, both missed a penalty as the away side. So I really hope that by this time next week, some Sunderland fans of a certain age making their way back home north, thinking, do you know that had a lot of parallels with how we played against Swindon? Because look, Swindon definitely acquitted themselves much better to the Wembley surface and the prestige and the occasion, and they seem to thrive in, you know, the opportunity. Whereas, you know, a lot of our players seem to go into their shell. And again, you know, Sunderland at the moment, like us back then, they've got a relatively young team, and of course, Regis Bris now has the responsibility of not necessarily putting pressure on and the incentive of Premier League football, but maybe trying to impress upon them that try not to let it pass you by. Try not to have too many, if only I'd done this, if only I'd done that after the game. You know, because at least if it doesn't work out in the way hoped for, you want those young players coming off thinking, well, I don't really think there's much more I could have done.
Yeah.
But of course, Chris Wilder might be saying a lot of the same things.
Chris Wilder will be saying a lot, you can guarantee that. Just to bring Gavin on this, because I'm interested to hear your kind of response, Gav, to building off what Kieron's just said. Because if you look at that second leg, you know, after that first half hour at the Stadium of Light, you know, Coventry kind of took control of the game, really, and territory possession. And Regis Bris admitted after that wasn't the game plan, and he wanted us to have more of the ball. I mean, is that a concern that actually we try to play a bit more expansive, we try to play a bit more on the front foot, we tried to attack more against Coventry at home, but we couldn't? I mean, is that an actual worry going into the final that happened against Coventry? And now looking at the league table, obviously we're playing a better side in the final in Sheffield United.
I think you've got to try and pick through it, and you definitely can't just brush it off and say it's not a concern. But I think the manner in which we managed to navigate it anyways was good. You know, despite the fact things didn't go in our favour, we stuck to our guns, we defended well, we came through it in the end. And yeah, Coventry are a good team in possession, but I've been having this discussion quite a bit in the last few days because I get not annoyed, but I get a little bit ticked off about the fact that people seem to be playing down the way Sunderland played and playing up the way Coventry played, purely because Coventry had control and possession. But Sunderland had good chances. Sunderland put their chances away. And for me, if you defend as well as Sunderland did across the two games, I think you deserve to go through. All right, there was a bit of fortune. The second goal down at Coventry was a gift, but my end, I still had a lot to do. Yeah. You know, but at the same time, and I said this the other day when we recorded, Chris, there's more than one way to skin a cat. There's more than one way to play football. And I watched that cup final yesterday where you had one team trying to pass the other team to death and the other team breaking on the counter and defending well. And the team who countered and defended well won the final. And I just think that there's, I think we're starting to see a little bit of a shift in football in the way people play the game, because for years now, it's almost felt like everybody's wanted to emulate the way Guardiola's team play and keep the ball and control games. And the likes of Sunderland and Nottingham Forest in the Premier League this year have done it virtually every week. And then Palace in that final have shown, no, actually, if you've got pace up front and you've got clinical forwards and you've got good defenders and you can stay solid as a unit, it's almost a more comfortable way to play. I think if Sunderland try to go toe-to-toe with Sheff United, we'll get beat. I think I'm not saying we have to be as defensive as we were against Coventry, but I think I just think that style of play, if you look across the span of the season, that is what has got us to this playoff final. It's not by playing on the front foot. And I think the players recognise this. I think the coach recognises this. And I just think if we go to Wembley and we play in that style, I'm not saying, we can't play backs to the wall for the entire game, but if we just do what we're good at, we've got a far better chance of winning. And it's just done me head in a little bit the last few days listening to some of the outside noise on that.
I think because if it is to be Trey Hume and Sirkin as fullbacks, and if you are forcing teams wide, one of the advantages you have with both of them is that they've got a not too dissimilar stature to centre-backs. For all looking nine small for a centre-back, both Hume and Sirkin have got a good stature for fullbacks. And of course, it's not only giving you a slight advantage in an aerial sense, but it can be quite off-putting. I mean, at times, if I was up against a fullback who was my own size, I might be confident some of the times about jumping for a header. But if I'm up against a fullback that's maybe even 6 foot without being 6'3" or 6'4", it can be a little bit daunting. So you can you can adopt a cautious approach without it necessarily being what was seemingly the case at Coventry. And to be honest, I think you have to do that to an extent because you are coming up against one of the division's best teams. So that, of course, is what the Regis Bris is tasked with over the course of the next 4 and 5 days. And, Gav spoke about you hear criticism at times of Guardiola that he's wasted and spoiled football. And I would still be of the view he hasn't. It's maybe so many others at times try to mimic him because his responsibility isn't strictly to football. It's to Manchester City. And he's, of course, got the luxury of being able to spend fortunes on many of the world's best players in respective positions. But, there's elements of football now I just find exceptionally off-putting. I think individuality has been eroded in a significant manner. And I think it's became so risk-averse. And even been going back to when I was playing, we placed a great value on possession. But Dennis Smith would always say to me, Kieron, if you're in that final third, take people on. Take people on. Take people on. I want you to get to the byline. I want you to cut in and shoot with your right foot. He would give me that license. He would call it a license to lose it, right? And he would say, Kieron, I don't mind if you lose the ball. And then he would say, Kieron, you're braver than some of the other players. You're braver than Bolly. You're braver than Gary Owers. And I would be thinking, I don't tackle. I don't head the ball. How can you call me brave? And he would say, but your bravery is that you're prepared to do things that they can or won't or both. I realise that they're courageous and they're physical. You're not. So I think now that possession has went to an extreme. And sometimes I watch a game, like Gav was talking about watching the cup final yesterday, and at times I'll find myself watching a game that I've got no emotional interest in. And I'll see a winger get the ball, and before I know it, I'm letting out expletives at this winger because he won't take, and it might only be a 30% chance that it will end up in a goal or even an attempt at goal. But certainly in our day, we were told, if I think that's 30%, go for it, that sort of thing, because if you go for it and you lose possession, the other team might be in their own penalty area. And then you've got time to regroup and get back into position and things like that. But you see that many wingers in particular, they'll just come back and they'll play it back to the full-back and then it'll go along to the centre-backs and the other full-back. And
Jack Grealish is one that stands out, isn't he?
Grealish you're right, Gav. He's been, I know he played further infield at Villa, and he, of course, maybe stood out because he wasn't playing alongside players that were as good as what he does now. But there's a very strong argument that for all Guardiola is a very successful manager, that with some players he's simply not been able to produce. And I think Grealish is really one. For all Jack Grealish I believe he's got issues. But even with that, I mean, he still makes the squad and still plays from time to time. But he's never really looked the same player at Man City as he did at Aston Villa.
Yeah, I'm just sitting here with an absolute, cheesy grin on my face, longing for the days of two wide men and a big man, little man up front.
Yeah.
Going back to those days, to be honest.
You know what? Without veering off on too much of a tangent, Chris, though, you look at that Yamal at Barcelona, just takes people on and shoots.
Yeah.
But the reason he stands out so much, not just because he's a world class footballer, is because he does that. It's so and it does it just frustrate. I'm the same as you, Kieron. Honest, if I sit back and think about football, right, I don't watch a lot of football now, and it's because it bores us, and that's why I think, not just because I'm a Sunderland fan, but I'm so wedded to our approach through this season, because I actually think what we've done, it might not be the prettiest, but we're actually trying to do it a bit different. We're not trying to pass teams off the park. We're not sucking the individuality out of players like Mundell and Roberts to an extent.
Yeah.
And Mayenda, who runs the length of the pitch and tries to score a goal and sometimes has scored goals.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? I think Sunderland are quite unique in this league, and that's maybe why we're in the playoff final. And honestly, I could go on about this all day, but
the one thing
I've really fell out of love with wider football because of that.
Because I know there's still a degree of an enigma around Patrick Roberts. At the very beginning of the season, there looked to be a bit of promise because I think he'd managed a few assists and played a part in a few goals. But then as the seasons went on, when you're looking at those key indicators, they haven't been there. But he's got this inclination at times to drop, albeit on the touchline, to drop deep towards maybe near the centre line. And he's not the only winger I've seen it. Like San Maximum at Newcastle was a little bit like it. Ryan Kent, who played for Rangers for a number of years, they could, from the halfway line to the final third, they looked fantastic. They could dribble, they could go by people, nutmeg people, turn and move in a different direction in an exceptional way. But there wasn't enough coming from the final third up to the goal line or in towards the goal. And of course, in terms of goals. And I know you can't strictly say to the other outfield players, look, don't give Patrick the ball unless he's in the final quarter at the very least. And then if it was me, I would be working with him, running with the ball only in certain ways. Because he's the type of player that will put bums on seats. He's the type of player that will get, nutmeg, he went by him. But he's not the type of player that results in fans too often going, yes, goal! And the thing is, as an attacker, it's certainly somebody that's very often at times should be playing in line with the central forward. That's what you're hoping for. Now, the difficulty a lot of wingers have now is that because so many teams only play with one recognised centre forward, the idea of, going back to my day, getting to the byline and putting it in was that you quite often had two centre forwards who would be going for it, and quite often one of them would be very, very competent in the air. And then I was fortunate enough that I had people like Gordon Armstrong, who was exceptional in that regard. But I don't think, Patrick Roberts, for me, certainly would be the one, and it might be too late in the day to do it, that could be a match winner. I've seen him in the early part of his career when he was on loan for a number of years at Celtic. And he's playing for Celtic. They're attacking almost all the time. But he was scoring the types of goals then quite often that we haven't seen enough of. And, certainly over the course of the latter part of this season. But you never know. I mean, he can still unlock defences by through balls and passing. So it'll just be interesting to see how Bris approaches it in terms of personnel as well as, of course, the tactics.
Well, I was just about to ask, because you talked a lot about Patrick Roberts there, and obviously in kind of in extra time, Mundle and Chris Rigg made the difference, really. They got us out a little bit and kept the ball a bit better than we were. And Roberts was one of those who made way. And there's been a few kind of voices asking, what has he produced lately? And in these 2 games he did, when we tried to get the ball to him, it didn't seem to stick, and he didn't seem to kind of keep the ball maybe as well as probably we'd expect him to. Is there an argument that maybe he comes out, or is that one step too far in a game like this when he's played so many games this season?
Well, I mean, see, even if you go back to, and I know it's not to do with what we're speaking about in terms of where his attributes primarily lie, but even if you go back to the game against Hull at home, where Anthony Patterson was the one that was blamed for the goal. Yeah, I think it was the Hull game. Yeah, the committed the near post.
In the corner, yeah.
I mean, look, Patrick Roberts was the guy on the front post. And this is certainly not a criticism, because I was the same myself. Having him in that position was maybe a design flaw, because I think you need somebody who's maybe a better header of a ball in that position. And of course, I think he sort of jumped within himself as opposed to extending himself. And when players are asked to do things like that really go against their nature, and it can maybe make them a little bit deflated. When I was playing, I loved Dennis Smith saying, Kieron, see corners, you just stay up. Stay out the way, because you're a hindrance. If you're back, even if it's an extra body, it's you. You're just a liability. And I think when you're getting asked to, and I understand why, of course, you're getting asked to help the team and show that you're willing and step out your comfort zone. But you can sometimes tell with body language that, things could be better. And of course, with Patrick Roberts and the intricate dribbling ability that he has, you're always hopeful that you've got him not only as fit as he can be, but feeling as fit and being as confident as he can be, and trying to make sure that that's utilised in the way that would be of huge benefit for him and, of course, and the team. And I've seen enough of him to know that he can, he can score goals, and we've seen it at Reading a couple of seasons away, I think, where he scored 2 in a midweek game. That when he gets into those positions and he's full of confidence, he's just got a magical way of working it onto his left foot. And at times, maybe he should be finessing it more or working on that, as opposed to maybe putting his foot through it. But these are all the decisions that Reggie has in front of him in the next sort of week or so.
Yeah. I mean, Gav, do you think Register Breed will look at that extra time, that change in the game and who we put on? Do you think he'll look closely at that, or do you think he'll just say, well, that worked in that situation, and I'm going to go back to the kind of, the trusted players, if you like, from that starting 11 and go with that again? Because it'd be a big story if Roberts wasn't in that starting 11.
I think he starts. I think he's shown complete faith in Roberts all season. And it's interesting, and I say this to people when they criticise Roberts, every manager he's had at Sunderland has started him whenever he's fit. He's loved for reasons beyond producing goals and assists. Although this season he's actually, if you look at the assist chart for the league, Roberts is still in the top 10, I think, for producing assists this season. Okay. So he hasn't, but I think we can all agree that he hasn't produced enough goals over the last 2 seasons in particular. But I just think that the manager has complete faith in him, and it's about what he does when he carries the ball forward. And the other element, which we haven't really talked about, is that we've not really had Roberts, I don't think we actually have had Roberts, Lefay and Mundle on the pitch at the same time, which is what I suspect we will see at some point in the game. And you almost have to, we always go back this, don't we, that relationship that Patrick Roberts had with Ahmad. But that came because they played so closely together. We've not been in a situation where we can get Enzo Lefay across, working with him, working with Mundle on the other side. And I almost think that's going to be our sort of, golden goose in this final, is that we've got a trick up our sleeve, which they're probably not expecting because they can't have expected it because we've not seen it ourselves. But if there's going to be a surprise in any sort of setup and tactics, I believe it'll be that. And I don't see, for as well as Rigg played when he came on, I don't see him starting on the right ahead of Roberts. I don't at all.
I think of the ones we've alluded to that didn't start, I think maybe for a goal threat, he might think of Mundle. You know, and he's young and he's energetic, and it might be that the time out has actually galvanised him and he's raring and ready to go. And I don't think, I would be surprised perhaps if Rigg starts. But there's no doubt whatsoever, you know, for all the season ended in a disappointing manner before we got to the playoffs, I think when you look back a little bit further, particularly in the first half of the season, you know, more or less the same group of players, which of course has been added to with Lefay. You've got to, you can't begin in thinking that Sheffield United are going to have far too much for us. You know, it's all about the notion of respect without fear.
Yeah. And here's another one I'm going to throw at you, Kieron. You know, the Patrick Roberts one, we've gone through that. But here's another one. Might sound really ridiculous when I start getting into it, but Dan Ballard coming in almost from, you could argue, from the cold, really, how many games he's played this season, although obviously he's had issues with injuries, etc. But there was almost, you know, an argument to say he was thrown in against Coventry because Coventry were top of the charts in terms of getting goals from crosses and putting crosses into the box. And he was put in to do a job. And it turns out to be that was exactly how the games went. Coventry put the ball in the box and Dan Ballard was there to put his head on it. But then coming to the final in Sheffield United is an argument to say, well, Sheffield United play a different way. They play on the deck. And with the bigger pitch, trying to keep possession of the ball and bringing it out from the back, you might think, well, that's more important. I mean, is there an argument to say Mepham comes back in, or just say, well, Dan Ballard's on cloud nine, you just leave that alone?
Well, I suppose the short answer would be, if you look at the playoffs and you look at the performances and, of course, the goal that was scored by Kiefer Moore, because for all Coventry do try to utilise the wide areas, they didn't have somebody in the middle that would be as adept as Kiefer Moore. You know, I know they've got bigger players, and I know Rudoni's coming from deep to do that. But, you know, and you look at Sheffield United's opening goal at Bramall Lane, you know, it was a corner that Kiefer Moore got on the end of. But when you look around the periphery of it, you can see that it's something they've worked on. I think it was Tom Cannon who was used to block the goalkeeper from getting out, and Kiefer Moore was there to capitalise. So, yes, Sheffield United will try and play on the deck. You know, they can play intricate. They can play in the wide areas. If they play Kiefer Moore, they've got that aerial threat. I suppose it would probably be easier for us to pick Sunderland's starting 11 than Sheffield United's, even if we had greater knowledge of them, simply because I think they've chopped and changed, and like Cannon has come in at times, and then he's one that hasn't really produced in terms of goals, but he certainly added to their performance the other night. I mean, there was a sort of school of thought that suggested that the best partnership was Mepham and O'Nien, and I could understand that, but equally I was thinking, and I know Luke's a little bit older and Ballard's the younger of them all, but if somebody was saying to me, of all these central defenders, in 5 years' time, who do you think would be the most likely to be playing Premier League football? It would be Ballard for me. But, geez, I mean, it seems almost blasphemous to suggest leaving out Ballard after both legs, because he produced at both ends in such critical moments. But if Sheffield United go with the same attack that they did in both legs against Bristol City, then Régis Bris would have to think about Ballard playing. Because, you know, unlike the intricacies around possession, if you're going to play Kiefer Moore, just like, you know, like in Sunderland's halcyon days under Reedy, if you were going to play Niall Quinn, you have to try and exploit the very thing that he can do, that just by dint of height and aerial ability is going to give him that advantage over others. And for all, I would never, ever doubt Luke O'Nine's willingness to do anything that was asked of him. In fact, he'll do things that isn't asked of him. But if a ball's coming into the box and all things are equal, and it's Kiefer Moore and Luke O'Nine, you know, you're maybe asking for a potential problem. Whereas if you can say to Ballard, look, we want you at set pieces or from wide, try as best as possible to be the one on. And Kiefer Moore will win a few of the headers, but he won't always win them as cleanly as is needed to get a very good attempt at goal. And those things are critical. Even the Haji Wright chance, I think it was Ballard's positioning that might have distracted him. And if he hadn't been there, the outcome might have been different. So there are little things like that to consider.
Yeah. I mean, Gav, do you think it even crosses his mind?
Nah, I don't. No. Obviously it is a massive, massive headache to have. But for me, Ballard in the air is imperious, and it's what won us particularly the first leg. O'Nine alongside him complements him well because, as Kieron said, there's not much he won't do on a football pitch for the team. And it's that fight and determination which sets him apart. But it's also the fact that he's good with his feet. Chris Mepham is an all-round... I've called him a Rolls Royce at times this season. But I don't know about you, but it is interesting to me that despite him being trusted all season, that he wasn't trusted for these games. And that he's I know we've dismissed the kind of the run at the end of the regular season as just being down to getting ready for these playoff games. But I don't think Mepham played particularly well in that run of games, to be honest. I don't know whether this is even a consideration, but he's a lone player. And sometimes, you know, he knows at the end of the season, he's got choices. Somebody like Luke O'Nine, this is everything to Luke O'Nine.
Yeah.
And to be honest, for me, Luke O'Nine's the first name on the team sheet, just for a lot of the reasons he doesn't often get credit for. But he's a real leader. It's just a shame that one of them has to miss out. It's going to be Mepham, I think. I think Dan Ballard has written his name on the team sheet with his 2 performances in the semis. But it's nice to have choices too, right? I mean, it makes us hard to predict, at least. I've just been looking at the 2 games we played against Sheffield United earlier in the season. Obviously, Mepham got sent off unfairly, in my opinion, at Bramall Lane, and it changed the course of the game. And I still stand by this. I think we were the better team in that game, and we're unlucky not to come away with something. And then at the Stadium of Light, I think Bris totally outthought Wilder in that game, because if you remember, he went 2 up front. They just lost Harry Suter to a season-ending injury, who'd been their star centre-half to that point, and they were playing a back 3. And for the Sunderland game, they had to have a rethink, and they went to a back 4. And our response to that was to put 2 up against their 2 centre-halves, went long over the top, and we caught them time after time on the break. They weren't expecting it. Now, I know this is a totally different game, totally different circumstances, but I do wonder how much that plays on Chris Wilder's mind, that he was... I don't know, he seems a very overconfident fella, doesn't he? But I don't know whether he'll be sitting back and thinking, I think Regis Bris probably got the better of us in the 2 games tactically. And I wonder how much that plays on his mind. And I as well, just to go back to something as well, on Kiefer Moore and his aerial threat, it's a concern, of course it is. He's one of the best headers of the ball in the league. But Coventry had the best attacking stats for a team with balls going into the box. They crossed the ball more than anybody else. They've scored more goals than anybody else from crosses into the box. And whilst we conceded 2 goals from crosses into the box, I think in the main we dealt with it pretty well. And I actually, I think that game on New Year's Day, Kiefer Moore barely touched the ball and he missed a penalty. He had a bit of a stinker. So I do understand the point. We've got to be wary of him, but I don't think it's the be all and end all. I just think Ballard is possibly the best choice at the back to partner O'Nine. And I'm interested, to be honest, to see more to see what Sheffield United do, because they're a good team. Clearly, they finished way ahead of the pack as the third best team in the league, and had they not had a bad run, they might have went up automatically. But I don't look at their team and fear them. I don't look at them and fear them at all. They've got one standout player in Harmer, who I think is out. He's in that category of far too good for the Championship, perhaps not good enough for the Premier League.
Yeah.
Maybe alongside, Josh Brownhill at Burnley. But other than that, I don't look at Sheff United and fear them necessarily, and I don't think the players will. So I'm not worried about how they settle at all. I think if anything, the Coventry games were the perfect preparation for playing Sheff United, because we almost reassured ourselves that we can defend well against an aerial threat.
Yeah.
And Kieron, just think about, I mean, you said at the beginning that, you had thoughts about playing in the top flight, and we were just talking about Luke O'Nien there, because what a story that would be, coming up with Sunderland from League One, and then he would finally be a Premier League player. I mean, when you're in the build-up to a game like this, going back to your experience, is it difficult to not think about what's on offer if you win the game, rather than just focusing on that 90 minutes itself?
Again, I mean, I think it's different for each individual, and I think sometimes your age and what you've done in your career prior to that can play a part. So you're right in highlighting Luke O'Nien, because it may well be that an opportunity like this doesn't present itself in the future. You just never know. And I think he's 30 now, or 31. So his chances of playing in the top flight in England are, reducing on a year-by-year basis. So, but the great thing about him is that he seems to have an appreciation of his career, almost irrespective of what league he's playing at, what club he plays for. I used to hear it, you would hear it about Bolly, he'd run through a brick wall for Sunderland, whereas Bolly would have run through a brick wall for any team. In fact, he'd probably just run through a brick wall because he was bored, right? Let's be honest. And Luke O'Nien, he's an equivalent in the modern era. He fully subscribes to the idea of doing additional work that will give him an extra 2%. And give it, so all of those, you think back to his opening game for Sunderland. I was at that game, I think, was it Charlton?
Yeah.
I mean, he was a rabbit in the headlights. He looked completely, and this is in League One, albeit at Sunderland. And of course, he's worked hard, and I've got no doubt he is on it, different coaches around fitness and strength and conditioning. How can I improve here? How can I get better there? And it's not all players will do that. And at times, a lot of these things are left to the discretion of a player. It's not imposed upon you. And you can just tell that Luke O'Nien's one who almost has an attitude, without, of course, comparing them as players. It's almost Cristiano Ronaldo-like. How can I get better in this area? How can I become much better in that area? And to that end, he deserves a lot of credit. The other side of that is, and again, it can probably be reinforced with the height. Maybe players like Bellingham and Rigg and one or two others are in a similar position to myself when I was 18, maybe felt, well, even if we don't get promoted, I'm very confident from what people say and how I'm reported on, I'm going to go on and have a very successful gold and glittering career. So the sense of loss, if it does come to that, might be more felt in the minds of some players privately. There's certain things that players just know you don't say publicly. So some players wouldn't say, well, I'm just thinking of me, and this is my last chance to play in the top flight, because that isn't the humility you're meant to show as a footballer, which incidentally, fucking no footballer subscribes to, by the way. They've all got self-interest at heart, and why shouldn't they? But you want to play in the top flight, and I suppose the kindest thing I could probably say is that some of their contracts will have stipulations that if Sunderland do get promoted, they'll get a significant increase in their salary for all the time that they're playing in the Premier League. And I suppose the credit you would give some of the players is that I don't think that'll be too much to the forefront of their thinking ahead of the game. You know, I think they'll want to go and win. I think they'll want to play against the Man Cities and the Liverpools and, of course, playing a league derby. So what exists in the mind and the motivation and the longer-term thinking of one player can often differ from, you know, what your teammate or your friend thinks, because their circumstances may be different.
Yeah. I mean, Gav, I haven't actually read anything or seen anything, but I haven't looked, I have to admit. But we're recording pretty much going into the final week in the leading up to the game. Do you know if the players are getting away from things? Are they getting out of the bubble, or are they staying put in, you know,
They're not going to Menorca. I know that.
No, they're not going on the pitch for 3 days, that's for sure.
No, well, as you know, I see the players driving into training most mornings, and I've seen them the last couple of days.
You stop them going into training. I don't think see them going into training.
They stop me. They drive through where I live. No, I did. I've seen Enzo Lefebvre, Jan Paveda, and a sorted of as they're driving into training this weekend. So I don't believe they are, no. But I think that would be the wrong approach anyway.
I would love to know what qualifies now for the rock and roll lifestyle. Would be somebody say, I seen Enzo Lefebvre having a bag of chips, you know. He shouldn't be doing that 3 months before a big match.
Well, can you remember, was it Maguire and McGeady having a McDonald's? I think that's as rock and roll as it gets, isn't it?
Jeez, that would have been... I mean, look, you know, like Ronaldo in the AS, I mean, he's redefined what 100% dedication to your craft is. I mean, when I was playing, the guy that was the 100%, or the guy that we all looked up to as this wonderful example of dedication, was the guy that only get drunk twice a month. It just shows you how times have changed.
Well, I think didn't you disappear from the squad to go and see Wet in Glasgow?
Well, no, it was I wasn't drinking, but I missed my first day of pre-season training because I was a fanatical fan of the Pet Shop Boys. I still am.
Oh, Pet Shop Boys.
So I'd went to see the Pet Shop Boys in Glasgow. And my plan was to get the train back the following morning and be in time for training, but there was a train strike. And by the time I was in Glasgow, I knew there was a train strike, and I knew that the bus I was going to get would get me back into Sunderland about 12 p.m. And that, I mean, look, if I'd asked Dennis Smith, he might have been receptive to it. But do you know the thing I'd done that really added insult to injury? He knew I'd gone to Glasgow to see the Pet Shop Boys, but he was, of course, expecting me back for training. And I arrived back at 12 o'clock and I went straight to Roker Park, by which time the lads had just finished their really physical morning session. And I stroll in and really add an insult to injury. I was wearing a Pet Shop Boys on tour t-shirt. You know, and so Dennis is probably thinking, are you taking the fucking... I just did a spectacular lack of awareness and I got fined. I got fined a week's wages, but that wasn't drinking. That was just because of how devoted I was to Neil Tennant and Chris Lowe.
Well, they say now we're getting back to the proper rock and roll years, aren't we? That's the one. Well, yeah. So, just in case we might speak to you again, but we might not. But I don't know if you can get your crystal ball out, Kieron, and tell us how it's all going to pan out for us.
Oh, jeez. Going back to what we've been discussing, I wouldn't be surprised if containment is part of the approach, but not necessarily for 90 minutes. You know, because a lot of the top managers now do try and divide it into parts of halves and things like that. But I don't care how much you know about football. I don't care if you're an authority on the game or a player, an ex-player, a manager. The most difficult thing to do is predict a result or even an outcome. And this, on the face of it, is very, very close to call. And I think it might be just an individual piece of brilliance or an individual mistake that on the day proves decisive. And of course, I could say Sunderland just to placate the listeners, but the honest truth would be that it's just so hard to call. In fact, forget that. Given how we've vilified him to an extent, Patrick Roberts to score the winner.
It would be poetic, wouldn't it?
Oh, yeah. Not just for us three.
Yeah, that's it.
You know.
Yeah. No, that'll do me. Brilliant. Well, I'll take that. But on that note, it just leaves me to say a big thank you for your time, Kieron. It's been an absolute pleasure as always.
Thank you.
Always wise words. Brilliant. Cheers, Kieron. And thanks again, Gav. I mean, this isn't going to be the last time. We've got a whole week of previewing this game, haven't we?
We have indeed. We've got a whole host of guests lined up and different personalities involved in various ways with the game. So we'll be speaking to a bunch of different people. Yes, we've got lots coming up, mate. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, it's going to be good. It's going to be nail biting, that's for sure. But yeah, thanks again, everyone, for listening. We've got loads of pods talking about what's going on in the current day, like Gav's just said. But we've got loads of pods looking back to the history of Sunderland AFC, if you can't get enough of that in the build-up as well. So we've got something for everyone, especially those who want to soak up every single second from our playoff semi-final victory. We've got loads talking on that. You'll hear Gav's voice lots talking about that moment and that game. But we'll be back.
I promise I'll try and move the conversation along a bit.
Oh, no.
Promise.
People can't get enough of it, man. But we'll be back with a lot more this week as we build up to Wembley. But from us, bye for now.
This podcast is part of the Sports Social Podcast Network.